Today we're going to talk about the reserves that the Russians are activating to keep fighting the war. At the end of March in Zeret province, the Ukrainians massacred a group of Russian forces that were part of the 76th Guards Air Assault Group. Now, the 76 has been fighting in the war for a while. They've been defeated a few times, but they're generally considered some of the better Russian troops. They were part of the military formations before the war and generally had the best equipment because they were some of the best troops. Well, when they came up against Ukrainian forces this most recent time, they were fighting in T-55 tanks, which were tanks that were built right at the beginning of the Cold War back in the 50s, so these things have been considered by Russian standards outdated by over a half a century, and yet, here they are being used by the elite forces. They don't move as fast, they don't shoot as far, their armor is thin compared to modern tanks, but most importantly they require 4 people to operate instead of 3. So, much more manpower intensive for much less bang for the buck. And the fact that these things are being used at all is a bit of an issue for the Russians, so at the beginning of the war, the Russians had 12,000 tanks, of which about 2,000 were in active service. The presence of the T-55S in the hands of elite groups means that those original 2,000 tanks are now all incapacitated or more likely just flat-out destroyed. Now, the Russians have very, very deep reserves. There's another 10,000 to go, but as you dive into the reserves, you're getting into older and older tanks, or that's what it would logically seem. Actually, they're starting with the oldest ones first. The issue is that the T-55S had no optics, they predate optics. And so when you want to bring a new tank into service, you can throw some cheap optics and actually get it through the refurbishment process fairly quickly. Where if you have a newer tank, say a T-72 or something newer, those had optics, but it's been 30 years that they've been in storage, and so all the seals have gone and the wiring's bad. And so you need to replace something that was already there as opposed to slap something aftermarket on it in the first place. That requires more advanced equipment, a lot of which the Russians don't have anymore. And so the T-72S and newer tanks take a lot more effort to refurbish. So the Russians are starting with the old tanks, but the bottom line here is that the entire pre-war tank reserve is gone, and now everything that they put on is something that they're having to update. The same goes true for soldiers. Based on whose numbers you're believing that somewhere between 550,000 and 750,000 Russians have been killed or incapacitated by the conflict so far. Well, that is the entire pre-war army, and the Russians are having to put new people, recently drafted people into the field with minimal training. This is now meaning that there is a problem with inflows. The Russians have not had a problem doing kind of a silent draft, where anywhere between 15 and 45,000 people are unofficially drafted every month. The Russians have flows of people to spare, but the source is not bottomless. At the beginning of the war, the Russians had about 8 million men in their 20s. Well, if you've killed roughly 600,000 or incapacitated 600,000 and another million have fled, you're now down to about 6.5 million left. So, if you look at the number of tanks that they've got in reserve, you look at the number of men in their 20s that they've got left, they can keep up this pace that they've been going for the last 2 years for probably another 5 to 8 years. And when that happens, they're out of gear and they're out of men. So that's how long roughly the Russians have that they continue this war and any follow-on wars. So we are looking at the twilight of the Russian system here. But it also means that since there's no longer resources that can be shuffled from other places in the Russian Federation, the Russians are now dependent upon this throughput for refurbishment, for training, for equipment coming from other countries in order just to fight the war in the first place. So, the situation in Ukraine for the Ukrainians isn't great, but the Russians have now run out of stuff to reposition and they're dependent upon that throughput. And that means economic and political factors both in Russia and abroad now massively affect the pipeline that allows Russia to keep men and equipment in the front in the first place. So we need to watch the Russian space and the adjacent countries much more closely now than we have because there's no longer any depth to what the Russians can do as soon. Ever wondered why the front lines of a battlefield constantly change? It's a fascinating dance of strategy, endurance, and survival. Today, we'll delve into an intriguing episode from history, where the momentum of war seemed to be in favor of one side, but reality painted a different picture. Imagine a war zone. The sound of artillery fire echoes in the distance, smoke blurs your vision, and the air is thick with tension. Now this isn't just any battlefield. We're talking about the Eastern Front during the Second World War, where the Russian forces appeared to have gained momentum in the latter part of the conflict. For the past month or so, it seemed as though the Russians were gaining ground, pushing their enemies back. The front line, that ever-changing boundary between the opposing forces, seemed to be moving in their favor. But appearances can be deceiving. Despite the perceived momentum, the Russians were unable to capitalize on their breakthrough at the Avita front. One would think that such a significant event would turn the tide of war in their favor. But instead, the front became static. The fluid line of conflict that once seemed to be swaying in their favor was now a rigid stalemate. So, what did the Russians do? They launched attack after attack, using their 76th Division in an attempt to find a weak point in their opponent's defenses. But it was a futile endeavor. The enemy forces held strong, and the Russian troops were cut up in the ensuing conflict. It was a brutal reminder that momentum in war isn't just about gaining ground, it's about maintaining it. And the Russians, despite their initial successes, found this task increasingly difficult. The pace of their advances was simply unsustainable. But the story doesn't end there. Despite the setbacks, the Russians didn't give up. The war continued on for another 5 to 8 years. It was a testament to their resilience, their determination, and their ability to endure despite the odds. So, what can we take away from this? First, momentum in war is a complex concept. It's not just about who seems to be winning, but who can maintain their gains. Second, breakthroughs like the one at the Avita front don't guarantee victory. And finally, even in the face of adversity, the human spirit can endure. That's it for this episode. Remember, history isn't just about dates and events. It's about understanding the why and the how behind those events. Until next time, take care.